Welcome to the Everybody Matters podcast, a show dedicated to the idea that when organizations care enough to show their people that who they are and what they do matter, they unlock the only business idea with truly unlimited potential. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at Barry-Wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. Leslie Peters is the founder, CEO, and chief facilitator at Elements Partnership, a consulting practice based in St. Louis that describe what they do as helping people and organizations get unstuck. Leslie's written a new book that's available on Amazon, Finding Time to Lead, 7 Practices to Unleash Outrageous Potential. Sounds a lot like something we would say at Barry-Wehmiller. In fact, Leslie's thinking about leadership is a lot similar to what we think here at Barry-Wehmiller and what we teach through the BW Leadership Institute. Here's a quote that puts Leslie's book and her way of thinking about leadership in perspective. Leadership is not what you do, it's who you are. When you take this approach to leadership, it's easy to find time to lead. Leslie's a good friend of Sara Hannah, one of the partners of the BW Leadership Institute. Recently, Sara sat down with Leslie to talk about her work and her book. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and listen, as Sara Hannah and Leslie Peters offer great insight for leaders at any level.
One of the things that's really important to me about the work that I do is that it's just really practical. So I grew up in Nebraska. My dad grew up on a farm, was an engineer. And so practical is sort of in my bones. But I also love theory. But you can't do theory if it's not going to be useful. And so I think in thinking about the book, the first thing really in all of my work is to take sort of these big theories and ideas and sort of make them into bits that people can just use. I think we say, be a great leader, be a better leader, but we don't actually give people specific tools and ways they can go about doing that. And I think that is a disservice to sort of what we hope for people. So what I had hoped with the book was that it would feel like that it would be practical, that you would feel like, wow, I learned some interesting things that sort of expanded my perspective of leadership and who I might be as a leader. But also, I have these really specific things that I can do and try that will be practices that'll help me be a better leader. So I think that I wanted them to think first that they liked the book, that it was sort of a quick and easy read and accessible, to feel like it was a good use of their time and like there are really good, useful things in it that they can do. And then to do those things that resonate for them, which I think along the same lines as truly human leadership, is really about sort of treating people in a way that brings out their best selves. So sort of some ways that we can show up as our best selves and that helps the others around us do the same. Are the things that I hope people take away from it.
Yeah, and you talk about these 4 shifts, that people have to make, leaders have to make. Can you think of, and you've coached all these CEOs and all these leaders of organizations, can you think of a person that you have interacted with who's really been able to make some of those shifts and kind of what the pre looked like and what the post looked like?
Sure. In
terms of their life and their leadership?
Yeah, I think there are a number of them. But there's one in particular who's the CEO of a company here in St. Louis. And actually it was really interesting. We've done a lot of leadership programs at his company, and we were launching a new one this year. And he did the program 3 years ago, and when he came over to launch this new group, he talked about his experience in the program, and one of the most important things was one of the things I talk about in the book, which is knowing your personal story, sort of knowing where you've come from and what influenced you and how you kind of got to where you are. And he talked then, 3 years later, about how sort of knowing that story and having some better sense of where he comes from and how he responds to things has helped him respond differently and better now. So he talked about, I used to get really defensive because one of my sort of come from places is that I want everyone to be happy. I want to sort of make people happy. That's always been my role. And as CEO, that's actually not so much my role anymore. Or sometimes to do the best thing, I have to make people unhappy in the moment. And I used to get really defensive when people came to me and told me about things that weren't working. And he said, I'm not perfect at it, but I'm aware when I'm doing it, and I can sort of talk myself out of it and have a much better response. So those are a couple of the shifts. One particularly is that shift from reacting to responding. So sort of when people say things and we have that immediate kind of visceral reaction, as opposed to being much more thoughtful and responding in a way that is sort of helpful to them, showing up as who we want to be, moves the situation forward, and really is how a good leaders respond. They don't just react sort of in the moment to everything that comes up. So that was a big one for him.
Yeah. So you mentioned his personal story.
Yeah.
What about your personal story sent you down this path of all the things that you could have done? How did you find yourself in the CEO coaching leadership space to begin with?
Good question. So lots of different things, but I've always, even from my first job, sort of been right-hand person to the leader. And so been able to sort of see up front, up close and personal, what leaders do and what they go through. And then I think, so my personal story, having grown up in Nebraska and in a small town in Nebraska, and having sort of all of these, what were then in my world, really big, weird thoughts about things. And so I feel like I've spent my whole life really translating things from sort of this big theoretical kind of thing that, frankly, most of the people around me weren't interested in and didn't want to talk about, to something that people were interested in and could talk about. And so I think that's a piece of it, is sort of this translator role is part of my personal story, like taking sort of big ideas and making them practical and useful. So that's one piece. And then I think the other piece is from high school was, president of organizations, and then in college was president of organizations and did things. And so always sort of had that perspective in mind, and so had a lot of personal experience with it and the challenges, and then had lots of opportunities to do lots of different things. Probably the most sort of the broadest experience was I worked for a national family foundation that started schools that teach deaf children to listen and talk. And so I actually started schools from scratch. It's really small, sort of quasi-public-private schools all over the country. So working with boards and leaders, and the leader of this whole movement and the National Foundation was sort of across all levels this interesting experience of leadership and the challenges of being a leader, particularly in a startup, which is a whole different kind of thing. I worked for a small organization, and it had about 35 people, and it was the most bureaucratic organization I've ever worked for, with 35 people. There were these amazing sort of stratas of people, so if you were on the admin staff, you signed out for lunch in one book, and if you were from the management staff, you signed out for lunch in the other book. And people would we were all on one floor, kind of in one big space, and people would still send emails to each other, like they would never go to someone's office or cube and talk to them. And when I was meeting with the man who led that organization, my 1 year sort of check-in, he was a really lovely man, and I liked him very much personally. And he said, "So how's it going?" And I said, "Do you really want to know, or you just want me to tell you everything's fine?" And he said, "No, I really want to know." So I said, "Okay, here are the things that are really challenging for me in doing this job and interacting with people here." And the job itself was sort of not really a job anymore, because the industry had changed, but they were just sort of on this static path. And so I had this whole long conversation with him, 45 minutes, about all these things I was seeing and how challenging it was, and he listened and took it all in. And then I went in a week later and told him that I was leaving. And he leaned back in his chair and looked at me and he said, "Why?" I sort of like, oh, wow. Because of all the things we talked about a week ago, that clearly he just didn't even take in or register in some odd way. And so I think that when people sort of pretend to listen or pretend to hear you or sort of placate you in the moment but don't actually take action, or they might disagree, and that's okay too, to say, wow, I just don't see that. That's not my experience. I'm curious about what makes you feel that way and what are the things that have happened that led you to that, and really asking some good kinds of questions that could get at what's going on in people's experiences. So that's the one that comes to mind sort of most glaringly. And like I said, I was there for almost less than a year because it was just, and that's what happens, right? People leave when that's the structure and the setup. Really good, I like to think of myself as really good. Really good people leave because if I can't make traction here, if we're not going to move forward together, then I'm not going to continue to put lots of effort into this. Or they disconnect and just sort of do what they need to do to get by. And, getting the best out of people, as you guys know, getting the best out of people is our biggest competitive advantage. That is what companies are trying to do and can't do, and it is what produces innovation and productivity and people staying and clear cultures and values that get propagated and into the, that make companies sustainable into the future. And without that, it's sort of churn and burn and short term, and we don't really get where we want to go. I spent most of my career in nonprofits, large and small, and we talk a lot about how nonprofits should run more like businesses. And I think that nonprofits have really done that over the last 25 or 30 years. They run much more and very much like businesses. But we don't talk about what businesses can learn from nonprofits. So when I was getting my MBA, I was in classes with people from Emerson and Anheuser-Busch and, big, huge companies. And I was sort of like the, cute nonprofit person. And it struck me that I was at one point in that during that time running a small nonprofit organization that we actually were having trouble making payroll. And everybody would still come to work. Like they literally weren't getting paid on time. And everyone still came to work and did their work. And it really struck me that for-profits can learn a lot from nonprofits and the kind of mission-driven perspective and commitment that we create. And there are different ways to do that, but that is what happens when people care about what they do, beyond their paycheck, beyond moving ahead in the organization, beyond sort of any of those kind of extrinsic values. People come because they care, and they care about what you're doing, and they care about each other, and leaders create those environments or not, and that's why it's important.
Can you gave us a story about a team that wasn't so fulfilling. Can you paint a little picture? Because there's lots of nonprofits that have compelling missions that are still terrible places to work.
Yes, that's true.
Right?
Yes.
And so if you think about the yes and, right, the mission focus and the purpose focus and the challenge of creating that environment, can you paint a picture of where it's worked really well for you?
Yeah. So there are a couple of places. I would say that one really, and again, the book is written sort of for a CEO. I talk a lot about the CEO, but it's really applicable to the leader of a department, and it's really applicable to individuals who want to impact sort of their own space and their own team, whether they're at the top of the org chart or not. But one that comes to mind for me is actually a department that I ran at Washington University, and we were a new program, and we had sort of this mismatch of people, and we were sort of a small piece of this huge, very small piece of sort of a larger division of a huge institution. And we were really able to create our own little culture. So we had a little office, and so we worked with 600 volunteers around the world, and we had a conference, and we had lots of interactions. And I feel like the way that we interacted as a team which was positive and respectful, and we were able to vent when we were frustrated or things were hard, as they often were because we were a new program in this kind of little tiny thing. That really reflected in the ways that we interacted with our volunteers. And we got a lot of feedback from the volunteers and the people who then interacted with those volunteers in different ways about how much people appreciated their interactions with us and how they kept signing up to do more and signing up to do different things, and just voluntarily being willing to do more and more because of the quality of their interactions and their commitment both to us as people but also to what we were trying to create. And so I think that's an example of when it really worked. And a lot of people on that team are still friends. I'm still in touch with them and continue to sort of know them. And so that would be a piece that would fit that bill, I think.
One of the great parts about your book is the volume of tools, right? Because I think to your point, there's so many leadership theory books out there that don't exactly tell you it's Monday morning at 8 a.m. This is what you're actually supposed to be doing in your leadership. Of all of them that are in your book, which do you personally find the most difficult in your leadership? When you show up at Monday morning at 8 a.m., what's the most difficult thing for you to kind of keep top of mind?
I thought you were going to ask me, like, what's the best one, right?
I know we like to really dig into where your personal failings.
Yeah, right. Well, I've got a lot of those. I'm trying to think of the one that is sort of the hardest one for me. I think actually the one that, so I call these practices for a reason. Actually, there are two that come to mind. So I call these practices for a reason because we're practicing, right? They're not things we're ever going to really get every day. And so the one that I really am aware of as a practice is listening. It's such a basic thing, but it is something that I'm a talker. I'm a doer. I'm the old, sort of my personal story, I'm the oldest of three in my family and the only girl. And so my brothers would tell you that I'm really bossy. So I have the answers, right? I can tell you how to solve this problem. Just let me tell you how to solve this problem. And really what I should be doing is just listening. So I would say, and I have a teenage daughter, she'll be 16 in April, and particularly with teenagers, like the last thing she wants or needs from me right now is the solution, because she's got to be coming to her own solutions right now. She's going to be gone in 2.5 years to college, and if I've given her every answer, she's going to be in bad shape when she gets there. So that's a place that I'm constantly aware of the practice of it. And then the other one that that I think is tricky for me is the whole kind of default mode. Avoid being perfectly ourselves at all times. So I talk about in the book, I was sitting at a long table with my college friends, and one of them turned, we were all laughing and kind of doing our thing, and my friend, I was just sort of smiling at everyone, and a friend of mine turned to me and said, "It's really great that we're all so perfectly ourselves at all times." And that's exactly it. For 30 years, we've all been behaving the same ways and doing the same things, and particularly because we all kind of revert to our 23-year-old selves. But it is true that we are perfectly ourselves at all times, and sometimes that's not helpful. And so how do we be clear about when it's good to be in sort of our default modes and show up in the ways that are expected, and when would it be better not to? So that's a place.
Can you talk more about that? Because that's interesting, right? Because I think from our perspective, one of the things that we see all the time is that people feel like they have to be somebody different at work.
Yes.
Right? So and if you're somebody different at work and you're somebody different at home, you're likely lying in one of those two places.
Yes.
Right? And so can you talk more about what are the times where you might think more deeply about how I'm showing up versus going into that default mode?
Yeah, so that's a great way to phrase the question. So again, I think knowing our personal story means that we're grounded in who we are. So I know that, and often our greatest strengths are also our greatest weaknesses, right? So I'm going to pick sort of my bossy tendency, which other people now are like, you're not bossy. But it is sort of a thing that I carry, right, from the way that I grew up. And sometimes that's really, really good. Sometimes people just want, like, tell me where to go, tell me what to do. When I'm running a meeting, like, I need to be, people are like, thank you for just telling me where I need to go right now. Perfect. But when I'm listening to my daughter, and she's sort of asking a question or struggling with something, my tendency to say, here's what you need to do, is actually not helpful.
Yeah.
So I would say that if you're really grounded in who you are and what your sort of default modes are, you are more conscious of choosing. And I think that's the distinction. So it's a conscious choice to be who I want to be right now. And that might be the easy path for me, or it might be the harder path for me. Doesn't mean it's not who I am, but it's not sort of my natural, like, here's the answer, do it this way. It is responding and being and understanding the shifts and saying, actually, that's not helpful right now. I need to extend myself and do this a little bit differently.
Or, if I'm hearing you correctly, like, who you are, not to use it as a justification.
Right. Exactly.
That's just the way I am.
Right.
Exactly. Take it or leave it.
Right.
And I don't want to be inauthentic.
Exactly.
Versus making that kind of purposeful choice.
Right. Exactly. It's not sort of saying, well, I'm always the contrarian, so blah, here's what I think. Which is not always helpful, right? Sometimes it is. Sometimes you can say, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here, and here it is. The other thing is, it does not serve us as leaders to not be more flexible than that, right? Like, as a leader, we get all different kinds of people and situations and circumstances and moments, and the more we can be clear about who we are and choose the best of ourselves consciously in response to that situation or person or moment, the more we're able to be the leader we want to be and to create the kinds of environments that we all believe are important at work, and allow other people to show up fully as themselves as well.
Yeah. So if someone, you wrote this book and it has the tools and it's for leaders of people, right? If you have a span of care.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody who perhaps, right, CEO seems so far off, but I just got my first direct report. I have one person in my span of care. And I'm just starting out on this leadership journey. Where would you tell them to focus? Where would you tell them to start? How would you guide them if you were in a coaching conversation?
So one of the tools in the book that I think is really helpful is sort of asking yourself, who do I want to be right now? So I would probably just start with that one thing and have them really think about the great leaders they've known and interacted with, and what were the things about them that they really admired and respected and would like to emulate. And then to really look also at their own personal story, and how does who you are naturally map on to those things, because you don't want to create sort of a personal leadership that's all about looking like someone else. You want to sort of put your spin on it. So I would say it starts with kind of what kind of leader do I want to be, and being sort of having some ideas about that. Because people, you might think that there are sort of, people are always going to pick the same things, but that's actually not true. People really do choose different kinds of things that are important to them. And then how does that play with sort of, if you have a very sort of assertive, kind of maybe aggressive personality, then to say, I really want to be soft and caring is not going to necessarily work for you.
Right.
So how do you sort of...
It's going to be a long road.
Right, exactly, and maybe an uphill battle. So how do you take sort of those things that are about who you are and create the kinds of things that you want to be as a leader? So that would be, I think, because it's sort of... having the end in mind, so that you can be making some conscious choices as you start out about who you want to be in this role.
Yeah. So you talk about the role of the leader, and I know that you do so much work just a little bit more generically on culture, right? And you mentioned creating these environments, and people are inspired and they want to innovate and they want to stay and what have you. Can you talk a little bit about the factors that kind of create that, right? The leader being so critical to it, but then what also has to exist for that culture to be created.
So it's such a fascinating thing to look at sort of individual people and the social systems within which they live and work, right? And so each of us is a unique individual, and simultaneously we're embedded in these social systems. And so it's the sort of interplay between those two things, and we're both influenced by that at the same time that we influence it, no matter where we are in the organization. And so the idea of culture is this interesting then balance between each of us as unique individuals and the systems and processes in which we sort of coexist. And so I think, as Simon Sinek says, as the leader goes, so goes the culture. And so it really does start with the people at the top of the organization or within the department. You can create little subcultures. Better to have a sort of common culture. So it really does start from the top. And I think that it is very much about the interactions between the people and the expectations of those interactions, the shared expectations of those interactions. So and then how the system supports and doesn't support different kinds of interactions. So the CEO that I talked about, who said that he can be, his original responses were very defensive, and he's learned not to do that. If he stayed with that, if you went to him and said, this is an issue that I see, after he said, come and tell me, and his response was, what are you talking about? That's not true. I'm never going to go back and do that again. And when somebody tells me something that's going on that they want to work on, I'm probably going to emulate that response because that was the response that I got. And so I think that it lives and breathes in the interactions between the people, and then how the systems support or don't support that. So if somebody does something that's really outside of the expectations, does the system respond to that and say that's really not okay? Does the system reward the things that we are looking for? And to the Barry-Wehmiller communications training and really thinking about those behaviors that you all talk about, and sort of not just like, oh, we're all friendly here, is not sort of a valid way to think about it. We all say hello to each other. We all look each other in the eye. We all ask how we are. We take advantage of opportunities to be in direct contact, not just by phone or email. Those are the things that are important, the behaviors that are important in how our culture shows up.
Yeah.
So I think that's a place, too, to really look for those things and identify them.
So you mentioned this balance between kind of care and challenge, right? So we can't just all be nice to each other all day long and expect to make progress. And some feedback that we have gotten is, that we're really strong on the care side and not as strong on the challenge side. Can you and this is a conversation you and I have had.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that role for candor, that role for challenge, right? How does that look and feel and operate in a culture and maybe even for you personally?
So I would even call it a role for truth. And so the fact is, people aren't going to do everything perfectly. And we're all going to be sort of stepping in it at different times and not sort of showing up the way we want to. And having a culture where we will speak the truth actually helps us. And so one sort of interesting, there's a book called Parenting with Love and Logic, which is a great
favorite
book.
of ours as well.
Such a great book.
So good.
And one of the things, actually, I talked about this at a meeting we did last week in Chicago, is the idea that if you're in a dark room, right? So you're sitting on a chair in a dark room and you have no idea anything about this room, you're not really going to be able to move. Every move is going to be really slow and like, are there something sticky on it? Is it dangerous? Is it going to drop off?
Get injured?
Huge? Is it, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to if I say to you, this room is 8 feet by 8 feet, it has a solid floor and 4 walls, and there's a door in one of the walls, I'm going to be up and out of there in a minute and a half. right? So it's this idea of parameters and boundaries that actually really support people. So if I am behaving a particular way and I can't count on you to tell me if that way of behaving isn't okay, I'm going to be a lot more timid. I'm actually not going to step out as much as I might. I'm going to not be, or I'm going to just do this on this path thinking it's just fine, and I'm going to get 6 miles down the road and you're going to be like, all of that does not work. And that's going to feel incredibly unfair and incredibly disingenuous to me. You've been so nice to me and told me all along that I was doing a great job or that things were fine, and now you're telling me that they're not? Like, that's a huge way to undermine trust. So I think that there is a very clear and important place for truth. And so I talk in the book about what I call your come from place, which I think is an easy and powerful tool for this, is to get really clear about your come from place. And so we all do, you know, when you say, like, I don't get where he's coming from, like, we do have these places. Kind of mine is sort of deep in my gut is where I kind of feel it. And so when I have to give hard feedback, really think about this person and my care for this person and what I hope for this person and why this particular feedback is really important for them right now because of my vision of what I hope they'll be, not because I'm mad, not because I'm frustrated, not because I just don't like it right now or 6 people have complained about it. Get really clear about that person and my come from place about that person, and then I can deliver that message in a way that I can be confident and that feels right and authentic and helpful. And that's the place to try to get to with that.
I think it's really interesting what you said, because you think about giving feedback and perhaps even confrontation when somebody is outside the bounds and you're trying to draw them back in. But the reality of the absence of feedback makes somebody more timid, right? And so one of the things, you know, people say all the time, I just don't understand why people won't take the ball and run with it. Or I just don't understand why my team won't take initiative. And just even that analogy of how can I possibly take initiative when I don't know where the edges of the sandbox are?
Exactly.
Right? Run where? With what?
Right.
And so that's an interesting kind of thinking about both halves of that equation.
Yes, exactly. And I would say that one of the big challenges that we're hearing from all of the companies that we work with is this idea that we really want people to take ownership. We want them to take initiative. And first of all, our cultures generally are not built for that. I would say that our education system is not built for that. We have lots of young people whose main question in school was, what do I have to do to get an A? And so we have not trained people for challenge or initiative or ways of thinking that are sort of forward thinking. We've trained them to wait to be told what to do. And that's their expectation. They have a boss now, that boss will tell them what to do. And so it really is sort of at a personal level encouraging people and making them feel safe with the parameters, with the goals, with the vision, with the behaviors, with the values, with our, most importantly, modeling our own behavior as leaders that give people the freedom to start stepping into that and to risk failure, which is what I think so many people, particularly in high-achieving cultures, are afraid of. If you watch jazz musicians, when one of them is playing and the other ones are sort of doing just background while they're really leading the soloing, if they really love it, they'll like make a noise, right? They're like in it with the other person. They'll be like, like, right? And it's so cool. And you love to watch sort of how that happens because it's a really natural, like, I just loved what you just played. That was so great. And
there's a feedback and a recognition and a
right there, and it, like from your gut, right? Just in that moment, sort of a spontaneous, like that was so great, and you know that person's like, I just did my work and I feel great, and so it's a really good sort of watching improv jazz is a great way to get sort of a visual for that kind of smooth handoff and people being clear enough about the purpose and what we're trying to do together and trusting enough of each other to do that kind of handoff and to be really excited about what the other people are contributing.
If you imagine the corollary in a meeting, what we don't say to each other is like, wow, Leslie, that was great. Thank you so much, right? Like if we had the same behaviors when we're kind of, passing the baton in the business world.
We probably couldn't all just be sitting around and then go, woo!
That was great. Great presentation.
That probably wouldn't really work so well, but maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
But the idea of it exactly, that we could say, thank you. That was a really great contribution. Right in the moment, be great. Yeah. So many things to learn and do all the time. Again, back to the practice. Never perfect.
You can learn more about Leslie, her book, and Elements Partnership at elementspartnership.com and findingtimetolead.com. You can learn more about the BW Leadership Institute, Sara Hannah, and the services they offer at bwleadershipinstitute.com. If you'd like to find out more about Bob Chapman and Raj Sisodia's book, Everybody Matters, The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family, go to everybodymattersbook.com. For updates on the book, this podcast, to get a lot of great content and insight, don't forget to connect with us on the web at barry-wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening, and don't forget, Everybody Matters is the only business idea with truly unlimited potential.